So our second session today is called Communicating Values. Building upon our representations of values, our second session explores the platforms to communicate our ideals and the spaces to amplify our voices. We are pleased to welcome Michelle Joan Wilkinson, curator of the Smithsonian Institution National Museum of African American History and Culture. Wilkinson co-curated 2 of the inaugural exhibitions, and she's also expanding the museum's collections in architecture and design. Her interdisciplinary work spans art and history museums and the terrains of American studies, African diaspora studies, and cultural studies. She will be followed by Walter Hood, creative director and founder of Hood Design Studio in Oakland, California. Walter is also a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and lectures on professional and theoretical projects nationally and internationally. His practice, Hood Design Studio, works across art and fabrication, design and landscape, and research and urbanism. The resulting urban spaces and their projects act as a public sculpture, creating new apertures through which to see the surrounding emergent beauty, strangeness, and idiosyncrasies. Please welcome Michelle to the podium.
Hi, everybody. I know some of you may not be able to see me, but it's okay. You can hear me, right? Okay, great. Off to a good start. So, let's see. I can see all of you, though. It's great. Never have this vantage point. Okay, so thank you, first of all, for having me. Greetings. I'm sending you greetings from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where I'm... where I'm one of several curators. My title is museum curator, but there are about 15 other people that have that same title, so I always want to make sure that folks know there's a whole team of folks, curatorial folks working there. Also, I want to say thank you to the African American Student Union, the Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and Professor Tony Griffin, and to the many colleagues who presented at the conference in 2015 who were so inspiring and informative. Their approach to the topic of design and also to the conference model, and particularly in moments like we experienced just now with the Afro Flow Yoga, was really empowering and uplifting for me. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm talking about my work, curatorial work as a platform for really communicating the values related to the efforts that are bringing us together here today for Black in Design. This is an image of our building. How many of you have had the opportunity to visit already? Okay, great, right. I had to throw in some glamour shots because in talking with folks last night, I realized how many people have not had a chance to visit, and I know it is hard to get in, so I'll show you a little bit about what's inside of the building before I go into too much detail. So I was a professor for a couple of years. I taught at Bard College, and in 2002, I decided to pursue curating because I wanted to intervene in how African American experience and the history and culture of Black people across the African diaspora would be studied, valued, and understood in the present and in the future. But I wanted to do that in a spatial, kind of three-dimensional way through exhibitions. So today, I'm 15 years into that curatorial path, and I'm working to model how museum professionals make new histories. At the Smithsonian, I'm building the foundation for a national museum collection focused on the work of Black architects and designers. So there are many things that I do at the museum, but architecture and design is one of the areas that I focus on for collecting. One of the exhibitions I co-curated is titled A Century in the Making, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it tells the story of efforts to establish a museum in DC focused on the African American contributions. That term contributions is sort of kind of the language that has been used historically. And here I'm just showing you, related to collecting around architecture and design, a sketch by David Ajay, one of the lead designer and one of the architects that designed the museum. And the exhibition, A Century in the Making, really looked at the development of the museum, but it goes back a full century to also look at efforts as early as the 1920s, in which an African-American architect, E.R. Williams, actually created renderings, a 3D model for a project that was called the National Negro Memorial Building. And so what you're seeing here is his design concept, a rendering for that building, which looks quite like a lot of the buildings on the National Mall now. And if you just think about what that institution in the 20s could have looked like if that museum had been created versus what we have. At the bottom you're seeing a concept model for the museum as designed by Freelon, Ajay, Bond, and Smith Group. And that model is a little bit different from the actual museum that we end up with. You can see the difference in terms of the, the 3 tiers here, which are referenced in the Olowe of Ise sculpture on the left, one of the design inspirations that David Ajay used, and a 2-tier building on a kind of bigger platform in the concept model. So I'm really interested in how the museum is telling these stories related to architecture and design, and particularly, beginning with its own building as a space in which to do that. So from the very beginning, one of the experiences that you have on one of our main floors before you go into the history galleries is this presentation about the museum's history, and you see some of the sketches that I've referenced, as well as one of the Corona panels. So if you've seen images of the building, you'll know that it's a bronze-colored edifice, the kind of the surface is this sort of lattice work which is abstracted to reference and pay homage to the work of enslaved and free artisans and the work that was done in South Carolina, the work that was done in Louisiana. Think about all that intricate iron balcony work that you see. That's part of our architectural heritage, and we pay homage to that in the building's design. So people can actually come up and touch that. And there's a model there as well. And then this is what it looks like when the light is coming in. Ajay talks about this as dappled light. And as a kind of diasporic citizen, my mom is from Guyana and have a lot of family in the Caribbean, thinking about the ways that those brise soleils, those kind of sunscreens and sunbreakers create this refracted light. I think that there's a wonderful sort of reference that you see in West African countries and also in the Caribbean and now on the National Mall with this building. So the next couple of slides are really just to give you a sense of place. This is descending to the history gallery floor, and that floor is where A Century in the Making is on view. This is the lobby. The sculpture in the middle is by Richard Hunt, an African-American sculptor. The far left, there's a sculpture made of rubber tires by Chakaya Booker. Another view. And when you're right in the center of the lobby, you can look out on all 4 sides. There are windows at in every direction. You can see right onto the Washington Monument, which is right next door. But you're always aware, hyper-aware, that you're on the National Mall, that this Museum of African American History and Culture is really at the center of American history, so to speak. The Contemplative Court, a space where once you come out of the history galleries, you can really exhale and sort of, almost like we did moments ago, kind of reflect on what you've seen, what you've experienced, and shake some of it off or keep some of it with you. People have been throwing pennies into the court here. We didn't expect that, and so I think there's like some rule about how if people throw pennies into fountains on federal land, where the money goes, so I don't think it actually comes to us. It's pretty cool, though. This is our art gallery. So that kind of gives you a sense of some of the spaces at the museum and what people see, but what I'm going to talk about now is what really happens behind the scenes in terms of collecting. So when I started, it was important to me for the museum to have collections really specific to architecture and design. And one of the things that curators do in their work is collecting plan. So what is a collecting plan? It's really a written plan that guides the curatorial work and our acquisitions process. And so in order to build a centralized collection of works by Black artists and Black architects and designers that would span historical as well as contemporary design, we needed a guiding document that would allow us to do that. So the goal of the collecting initiative is to properly attribute the intellectual and artistic work of early Black makers within the history of design. But by also collecting from today's most innovative designers, the museum seeks to develop a noteworthy archive of design materials informed by the by the imperatives of social and environmental justice that lead the design field in the 21st century. So this work of thinking through these issues has been undertaken in many parallel processes by many of you, curators, scholars, artists, and historians. But still, the need for the kind of collections-based strategy that our museum is taking on is really, I think, important, and we're uniquely able to implement that. So this is another one of the exhibitions that I co-curated. It's called A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond. And at the museum, we've looked at design. We have materials related to architecture and design, but often those objects are used in service of telling other stories. So there may be stories about entrepreneurship, Black community life, social and political movements. So for example, in this exhibition where we focus on the Black Power era, we look at someone like Emory Douglas and his posters as a way of communicating the tenets of the Black Power movement, and really communication being a form of design, but really within the context of social and political movement. So design is there, but it's integrated in a larger story. And so with a plan for collecting in this area, what we're able to do now is expand our holdings in these areas and bring attention to the specialized categories of African American architectural history and African American design history. And just a side note here, art historian and scholar Lisa Farrington has written a new book where she kind of surveys African Americans in art. And she makes a point to talk about architecture and design, and really saying that this is one of the first survey volumes that really looks at the decorative arts, design, craft, and even architecture as part of a larger art historical canon. And so I think that that direction is there, but it's something that can be reinforced by the work we do at the museum as well. And so we're really interested in how these areas are relevant to the history and culture of African Americans in the United States and beyond. So where to begin? Not the talk, but where did I begin? In 2015, I assembled an ad hoc advisory group of scholars, curators, and designers to assist me with identifying priority names of architects and designers, collecting opportunities, and resources for the initiative. Members include Tony Griffin. You can clap. Thank you, Tony. Mabel Wilson, who you'll hear from later. You can clap for her too. Lowry Sims, who is one of my mentors. I worked, my first job in museums was at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and she's been one of my mentors since 2002. Michelle Washington, also in the audience. Paola Antonelli, who some of you know from having taught here, among others. And so that group has really been instrumental. And I asked them, and I also asked myself, what would make a collection at this museum, the National Museum, African American History, Culture, different from a collection from one at the Museum of Modern Art, or the Museum of Arts and Design, or the Vitra Design Museum? What was the intellectual framework that our museum was charged with, using for our collecting? So it was around this time, as I was thinking through these questions, that I attended the Black in Design conference. And that gave me much food for thought. A week after that conference, I attended the National Organization of Minority Architects Conference, which focused on social justice and design. Together, these two gatherings, coupled with the expertise on the advisory committee and visits to museums coupled with the expertise on the advisory committee and my own visits to museums that collect and exhibit design, helped me to formulate what opportunities stood before us at the National Museum. So I felt that the museum was really in a position to highlight design and architecture as critical sites of engagement about Black life. As Lowry Sims said, by looking at design, we look at, quote, how people conceptualized home, work, and recreational spaces, but also how their decisions reflect social hierarchy and civic relations, end quote. Looking at the physical manifestations of those design decisions also tells us a lot about what were the ramifications in Black life, and that our collection would need to consider issues of discrimination and displacement. We would need to consider the limits that Black architects and planners felt in terms of access, issues of spatial justice, restorative justice, and just cities, terms that we're talking about at that Black in Design conference. All these things would be relevant in our collecting. And so I was really beginning to see, and here I should pause to say, coming back from the conference, I think I purchased, it may have been a t-shirt, and we did, and took the program back, and we accessioned those objects into the collection. So there is Black in Design paraphernalia at the museum. So during that period, I really, and actually when I came back to the museum, I had to do a presentation, because when you travel, they say, okay, why were you there? Share your knowledge. And I did a presentation called Why Design Matters and How Design Matters, and the next couple of slides are from that. But it was through that, coming to those conferences and to NOMA, that I really began to think about how the museum would collect, and thinking about design really as literacy, kind of historical and cultural literacy, and the way the museum could make that more visible. And so, collecting things like renderings, drawings, prototypes, models, collecting material related to the process and stages of design, collecting in ways that, I'll let you guys look at this, I won't read it, but the idea of heritage through design, right? So three-dimensional objects that could be classified as fine design, contemporary design, things that also bordered on craft, industrial design objects, oral history, film, podcasts, recordings, design-related publications, conference proceedings, photographs. We also have digital-only collections, things that come in only as digital files, and archives. And I'll kind of make a note here. Since 2017, this year, we've collected 3 archives related to Black architects. One from Phil Freelon, one from Norma Sclarack, and another from Harold Williams. And that's a long-term collecting process in place. I have other colleagues that are working on fashion design, automotive design. My main focus will be architectural, product, and graphic. I'm going to skip a little bit. A Soul City is one of my favorite images. So I mentioned the exhibition, 1968 and Beyond, and in that exhibition we had a section about cities and suburbs, shifting landscapes. And when I got to the museum, I knew nothing, in 2014, knew nothing about Soul City. And looking through the collection and thinking about what stories we would tell, I found this, pamphlets related to Soul City, North Carolina, a planned community in development in the 1970s as one of the sort of like Newtown projects. And I was really struck by the graphics, which maybe we can come back to in the Q&A. But this was also a pivotal moment for me in thinking about, there was a whole history of design, architecture, space planning that I didn't know about, and that as a museum we needed to share more, but that I needed to continue to engage in that conversation. So why design matters, how design matters, design and race, design and control, design and surveillance. These are some of the things that I'm very interested in. And so our collecting framework is informed by contemporary understanding, okay, I'm wrapping up, of how design as a tool is a tool for eradicating justice, just as design has long been a tool for creating and maintaining inequality, from gerrymandering to redlining to planning for urban renewal. And so since I'm wrapping up, let me just say that our priorities really try to balance the kinds of stories that can be told through the lens of architecture and design. So like our other exhibitions, where objects are acquired to help us tell stories about individual achievement, community uplift, and political advocacy, design can do that, but we can also talk about technological innovation, artistic expression, cultural identity, and social change. And I will just move through. This is what's referenced in the exhibition. The Ebony Jr. I collected from the Norma Sclarack family, and it has an article about Paul Williams as well as Sclarack. And I'll just say that in planned communities, there's, let's see. Oops. Firecracker, okay. Wait. Up, okay. Well, up on the right, the this image here. This is a design project that Paul Williams did in Las Vegas as a planned community in the 50s, and so we referenced that as well. So one of the things I'm trying to make the point here is that not just in the collections that we're bringing in, but looking at anything that we put on an exhibit as a way to identify where design is relevant. And so Public Enemy, we had this large banner with Public Enemy, and one of the stories that I pulled out here was that he was a graphic designer, Chuck D. And the idea that this Target logo is really significant now in terms of racial violence and racial targeting. So let me end with this one. I think that gives us a good sense of what we're trying to do at the museum. Thank you. Next up, we have Walter Hood.
Do I click it? They'll do it. Thanks a lot. I've been up here, I guess, at the GSD on numerous occasions, but I have to say, this is the most beautiful crowd I've ever seen in this building. It's also one of the first times I've come in here and there's no tension. So thank you, my people. I'd like to talk today about communicating values through mnemonic devices. This discussion will explore the role of memory in public spaces and how these devices in the landscape can contribute to a better understanding of Black and brown space. Crucial to this discourse is the instigation of semiotics and particularly linguistics nomenclature, and how transgressive actions, and remember transgressive, how these actions and transpositions in the design process can be used to let us not forget. I will review these through case studies that look at three different lenses. One, the everyday and mundane, the second, commemoration, and lastly, lifeways. And these are three kind of lenses that I was able to, at the Art Institute in Chicago, really think about the first 10 years of my practice, that my practice was really trying to deal with culture, my culture and those experiences. And so this triad, in a way, is how we shape our work in the studio. This first project, I'm going to show some case studies, is a failed project.
Study this matter for 10 years and they can
It was in Norfolk, Virginia, and it dealt with massive resistance, which I had no idea existed in Norfolk. And I created a tensegrity piece, and then I worked with school-age kids, and they recorded the words of the day from 1955 to 1965. And some of the words are pretty amazing and explicit. And the mayor at the time said, "Walter, we're not ready for this." In Oakland, California, we miss this guy, I know. In Oakland, California, we were just working on a simple streetscape project, and we were able to kind of sneak in this piece. And so when you see a street sign from now on a highway, which is held up by a truss, you'll always think about the 5 brothers and sisters on here. And it's not tagged. There's no pedagogical display, but it's just there that you can't forget. In Nashville, Tennessee, we just finished a piece called Witness Walls, and it's made of concrete. And concrete's a material that's pretty much of the 20th century, and for me, of the civil rights. And so I was privy to images that the newspaper had taken of the protesters that were never published. And now there's an archive, and we actually have those images embedded in the wall. And then on the other side, I took the liberty to create my own images because I was blown away by these beautiful Black women taking their kids to school in the midst of hatred, but they were just beautiful. And so as you go to witness walls, when there's no light, there's no image sometimes. And then when the light comes out, the image appears. And in the background of witness walls, there's music, working with a disc jockey of the day that plays music during the 1960s. And you'd be surprised the soundtracks that you would hear. And Nashville is known for honky-tonks, but the soul music that vibrated during the Revolution was pretty amazing. And on the way of making this project, you see that police in the back are actually posing for a picture, right? And this young girl came up to me during the opening and she said, "Mr. Hood, is this from Ferguson?" And I said, "Nah, this is from 1968. And the guy pointing there is Freddie, who is the guy in the back, unbeknownst to me. And he came up to me and said, "That's me in the stranglehold." This next project, if you see the date, April 6, 2009, is still not built. If you go to Pittsburgh, go to the Penguins and say, "Build this damn project." This is the Hill District, which was pretty much raped, like most African American communities, mid-century, for a civic arena. And they had a project to do a rain garden for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and we won the competition because they said, "We want an artist and a landscape guy to come back and talk about the loss." So we collected about 7,000 images from people, and this piece is called Curtain Call, to come back to the city. And we scanned them, and now we have this amazing archive. People basically wanted to tell their entire life stories, and the images are etched in glass, and we'll create these giant curtains next to the stadium. And some of the images are pretty amazing, and the piece is inspired by August Wilson. And rain gardens, if you know it or not, can you cut it up? Rain gardens are supposed to clean water, but most people don't know what a rain garden is. So the Hill District, where this is located, was an amazing R&B sort of stopover, and so we've been sampling rain songs. So when you go in, rain songs will play, right? And so you'll have this idea of the accumulation, but you'll also begin to see the pictures of people who have been forgotten, and they're taking their curtain call to come back. And this project will get built. This next project is closer to our museum in downtown Washington, D.C. This is in the village of Nauck, N-A-U-C-K. And I have this sort of predilection towards Venturi because as part of my education at the end of postmodernism, there were these interesting theorists who were writing at the time. But Denise Scott Brown, I remembered this quote: "There is no reason why the methods of commercial persuasion in the skyline of science should not serve the purpose of civic and cultural enhancement." So I started thinking about these signs that say Friedmans Villages. You go to these historic places and they tell you, but they all look the same, right? And so in the village of Nauck, in this kind of suburban sort of Virginia, we're creating a town square where brothers hang out and the history is on the walls. It's also a place that people don't know the story, that Arlington Cemetery was the first sort of home and city that Africans, free blacks, were actually in a freedmen's village there for over 20 years. And so people the diaspora grew out of that, and they're still in Arlington, Virginia. And this community particularly wants to basically say, we're here. And so we've been working with them to develop a space. And so I came up with this piece called Freed, F-R-E-E-D, not free, because we were emancipated, and we forget. And this is the psychosis, right, that I think whites hold over us, but we have to understand in sort of reciprocation. And so this piece is meant to be this kind of emblem that sits in this sort of modest, beautiful landscape. And it's made of badges. We're working in Charleston on this idea that people had to sort of talk about who they are and where they come from. And it will sort of be 36 feet tall, and it's made up of thousands of badges. And it sets in a nice bucolic park. And what we're interested in is this kind of sylvan kind of experience, and then you have to deal with freed. And this notion of the everyday needs to be powerful, right? That not every place needs to be pedagogical, but they need to be everyday to remind us, right, that we can have these conversations in normal space, and that brown people can have great spaces as well as tell their stories. This is scheduled for construction next year. And so go by and be freed. Charlottesville, we made a project 10 years ago there, and I'm just going to show this. And with all of the issues in Charlottesville now, you can go to the campus and actually learn about a free black woman. And you can learn about it through this, how can I say, spiritual kind of piece we call the Shadow Catcher. It's a place where Catherine Foster basically provided her home to other blacks that came through. And I have to say, it's probably it's the only modern piece within the campus central sort of piece. And you go there, and it's a very reflective place. When there's light, there's shadow, and the spirit is allowed. A trip to heaven through this portal. And it's part of the campus. It's not a separate piece, so students have to walk through. So it's not a set aside. So it's part of the fabric of the place. And this is the cemetery, the burial grounds. Closer to home at the Bayview Opera House in the 1968, the African-American community was pretty much razzed. This community center became a home to them. A couple of years ago, we had a chance to restore it for these young, beautiful black kids. Before that, the city was treating it like a community center, and designers had hay bales, chickens, astroturf, talking about you don't know where your food comes from. And at our first community meeting, a militant brother came in and said, "I will shut this shit down if you don't hear me." And I was like, "Speak." And the project was all about an ADA ramp, but we made it about something more. And now there are these wings that go around the building. There's a new stage for outdoor performances. It's now a beacon. The kids can actually approach the building on all sides. There's performances in the landscape. And at night, it basically tells that story. And I would rather have my young brothers and sisters learning dance, learning theater, learning communication, than learning about chickens, right, and community gardens. Yeah? And lastly, how much time do I have? I'm okay? Cool. And lastly, I'd like to sort of end and dovetail the African-American Museum with the International African-American Museum. And this one is being built in Charleston, South Carolina, slated to open in 2020. The architects are Harry Cobb of I Am Pay Cobb Freed. We've been working now on this museum, I would say, about 5 years. It's been the labor of love from the previous mayor, Mayor Riley, who's been a great advocate of architecture and urbanism. Harry called me up one day and said, "Walter, you got to work on this project. It's all about landscape." I said, "Okay, dude." Had never met Harry Cobb before, so going and hanging out with Harry. Harry must be 90 years old now. And I have to say, he's one of the most humble, amazing people that I've had a chance to work with, because he's open enough to understand what was required of this project. The project is on a real site. We think at least 40% of the African slave diaspora landed here before making its way around the Horn. The site actually had a warehouse where they actually stored the slaves before they sold them. Many slaves died at this site. The ecology of the bay changed. There are stories of sharks actually coming in all the way to shore, because when the slaves died, they basically threw the bodies over. It's a site now where you go to and you would not know the story. There's an aquarium there. There's a historical museum that talks about the Civil War, but not about the people who landed here. So we were able to mark the site and do an archaeological dig, and we actually found the remains of the wharf. It was one of the largest wharfs in North America during the time. It's called Gadsden's Wharf. The building is a very simple building. Due to hurricane, it has to sit up off the ground, and it's about a football field in length. The architects kind of see it as this voyeuristic kind of scope, where you look out to the Atlantic on one side and you look towards the city on the other. It's going to be a different kind of museum, and it's going to be a museum where you can go and basically trace your ancestry. And I'm waiting. I'm just holding off because I want to know where my ancestors came from, so I'm waiting that this will be one of the first chances I get. And then on the other end, you look back towards the city, all of the bell towers and the landscape of slavery. we were asked to make a landscape here, and I'm only going to talk about one basic component. And what we thought about, we took a tour of the Low Country, we talked to scholars, and we tried to figure out, well, what would be the right way to treat the underside of this building? And one of the things that kept coming back was the water. And right now you sit up about 7 feet off the water, so you don't really have a sense of that. And there's all that stuff out there. There's battleships, there's marinas and all of that, and you really don't have a sense. But when you go out on the water, it's pretty powerful. So we took a boat to Sullivan's Island and then came back, and this is how slaves would have come there. And it's a pretty powerful piece. And so we've decided for the landscape to basically create a low country garden that comes in on one side, but to create a new water feature, to actually raise the water above that high tide level. At night, this will be a place like all other sort of spaces in Charleston. It'll be public, like you can walk in a cemetery in Charleston. You'll be able to walk into this space as well. And so I was inspired by the Brooks map. If you don't know this map gave fodder to a lot of abolitionists about the mistreatment and just the conditions in the hull of the boat. And I found this piece that was on Sullivan's Island in this meager museum that looked like this beautiful tapestry. So at first when you read it, you didn't know what you were looking at, but you're actually looking at bodies. And so we're taking the water and actually bringing it up on top of the shelf to create an infinity fountain. And hopefully once you experience this infinity fountain, you'll never look at an infinity fountain again in the same way. Yeah. And so here, there will be a place which you pass through and pass over. It will be a place of ritual. Hopefully you'll touch it. And there will be relics that we're bringing in from Africa and embedding it in that crossing. But it'll be a very simple kind of gesture. It's made up of tabby, which is a local concrete, and we've cast full-scale bodies in the tabby. And the bodies have a relief of about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch. And so all of these, about 40 yards wide, will be placed underneath the boat, that I call it. And then as the water starts to fill up, they become puddles. And then as the puddles get deeper and deeper, the water comes closer, and then they go away. And that takes about an hour. And then as the water starts to release, they come back again. And so you're constantly reminded of what took place on this ground. Thank you.
And Michelle, for your wonderful presentations. I think everyone in the audience enjoyed it. I think part of this discussion, which I'm excited to have questions from the audience start very soon, is that you're both talking about communication, not only in the here and now and the projects that you're currently doing, but how we communicate history, values, memory, legacy, and how you recapture that, both in a form of storytelling and a form of in a form of experiences. So I look forward to questions from the audience as we kind of think of communication not only as something in today's age of social media is happening every instant, but also in the longue durée of both past and present. So thank you again. And if there are any questions, there are 2 mic runners available. I think there's one in the back.
Hi, my name is Boo Boo. Came out from Oakland for this. Walter, I don't have a question. I just wanted to say I live in West Oakland, traditionally black neighborhood. I work in the financial district of San Francisco, a white as hell neighborhood. And when I take the 36 bus from Adeline and 18th in the morning, down Adeline, and up 7th Street, I gotta tell you, going under the trellis that you designed and kind of working my way out of West Oakland and into white San Francisco, it's hard for me to express how fortified I feel and how much of my blackness I get to bring with me into the city and make it through the day. And I didn't realize that you had done that. It's been my ritual every morning for years, and I want to thank you so much for providing that opportunity.
Thanks a lot, man. See you back home. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Antonio Ruben. I'm currently studying industrial design at Philadelphia University. For one, being able to be here and hear the narratives you all are telling is really empowering. Having my fair share of struggles of existing in a majority white space, but I want to say thank you to you, Walter, just even in the last piece you shared, the amount of thought that goes into what you all create is something I feel challenged with as a designer to continually tell my narrative. And likewise to you, Michelle, and I had a question to the regard of understanding that history is also about covering or documenting the present. I was curious to know if you all are considering or would consider competition work to feature contemporary and or rising designers or students. Yeah.
Yes. This is on, right? We're open to all of that, and even thinking about in a specific way in which we can continue to engage in those conversations. So not just documenting things that have happened by collecting that, but also the way in which the museum functions as a space for things like that to happen. Yeah. So yes, we're open to contemporary.
I just want to say thank you both for amazing presentations, and knowing both what you do, both as a curator and as an architect, can you talk a little bit more in both cases about the ways in which landscapes are problematic, contested, and racialized? And it's clear in your work, Walt, in terms of what you're trying to recuperate. But given all of the projects that you've now done over a number of years, can you talk more about that? And also, Michelle, can you talk a little bit about even the site of the museum as a kind of contested, racialized space?
Thank you for your work on this, Mabel. I think just to mention a book about the museum titled Begin with the Past, which goes through a bit of the history of the founding of the museum, but also the fact that when we were designing or identifying where the museum would be located, there were other sites that were being made available, and this particular space on the National Mall next to the Washington Monument was the one that most folks most closely associated with the museum wanted to have, but it was a site that there was a lot of struggle for because it is such a prime location. It's sort of this access point close to the White House, next to the American History Museum, and in thinking about the National Mall and what has happened there, it's also an area that there were slave markets adjacent. There's a history of enslaved black people passing through that space. There were slave pens close by. And so even within Washington, D.C.'s own history, one of the things that that exhibition, A Century in the Making, looks at is the site of the siting of the Museum on the Mall, D.C.'s Black history, and the space of the National Mall as having all of these sort of interstices right there. So I think that being there is the kind of visibility for the museum, but hopefully it also brings greater visibility to Black presence that's always been in Washington, D.C. and always been on the Mall.
If I can remember your question now, Mabel, it was a good answer. I think you asked about contested space and how do you deal with it. I mean, trained as an architect, landscape architect, urbanist, and an artist, site is like so amazing to me, and it probably didn't gel until I sort of spent some time in Rome and went on archaeological digs and started to see that we're everywhere, right? And I don't care if you're working in Jackson, Wyoming, or working in Seattle, or working in Florida, the sites are so charged everywhere. And what we're trying to do now over time is that you can't always scream out, right? And that you gotta find ways in which you weave these pieces into the projects. Because a lot of clients just be like, dude, we don't want to be talking about that right now, right? And so in the introduction, I think you mentioned this term, and I started to use it. Kind of every project that comes out of our studio, it has to have a strangeness about it. And that means that there's something a little different. And that comes from what people were talking about this morning, but it comes from our ability to take something and reshape it. And I'm talking culturally. And so for me, that operation is constantly trying to reshape something familiar. Right? And that familiarity isn't owned by anyone, it's all of us. Like, everybody knows what a tree is, right? But we want to like put them together in a way that you really know what a tree is, right? And that's where the site, I think, can just be a really powerful thing. But in today's sort of landscape, it's really, really hard because most bureaucracies, they want things to be normal, tidy, and they want to know the metrics before you even build it, right? And so again, I think you have to be more transgressive. Then how do you find that thing so when it's built, right, either people are throwing pennies in it or they're doing something that's non-normative. And but it's really, really tough.
Thank you. I think I share with everyone else how inspiring this is. I have a question kind of for both of you. And I'm White King, Africa Town, working in Seattle, and also from the hip hop generation. So with the spirit of hip hop, I would like to, for you, Michelle, at the museum, have you thought about how you can inspire, people in various communities, wherever they are, to begin to think about just curating spaces and extending, kind of the stories and the power of the stories, what we call hidden treasures in our own communities, to bring them to more of a common community level, right? And then the same with you in terms of, it seems many of the projects are on a large scale, they're, commissioned at a high level, big budgets, but also again, the same spirit of hip hop, just finding any wall and making it into a canvas, how people could be inspired to take some of the principles of how you're transforming space again to their own, guerrilla or just independent, smaller scale projects and impacts for our communities.
Yes, so one of the things I'm very adamant about, I think being a museum professional, is the fact that how do you get here, and really being transparent about my own process of beginning to work in museums, being a mentor to young people. And so that's part of my day-to-day service. As a federal employee, we really are public servants, and I see that as part of what I do for a living also, modeling what curatorial work is, what scholarship is, and introducing young people, whether it's high schoolers or folks who are thinking about another career, and this may be an avenue for that. And I think the museum, personally, I think the museum is committed to that. We have a fairly large education department, and there are programs that are for, 1 to 3-year-olds about beginning to learn about race and talk about race. There are programs for educators. With the design and architecture component, we're still newly in the process of really developing a collection specifically about this. And so it's a good question in terms of thinking about how our educators at the museum can be aligned with what this mission is, so that what we're sharing with young people is, is inspirational to them, is exposing them to these careers.
And real quickly, I would sort of answer your question sort of two ways. One is, I think we need more people of color like myself and others that you heard to be out in the community so that people can actually see that representation. I'm talking community meetings, I'm talking about, all of these things. It's really important that they see us in communities, but they see us at this other level, right? Not at this level down here where it's like, oh, we need to do some public, to really talk about things at an raise the intellectual bar. And that's just really important. Because a lot of bureaucracies don't want you to go out there and be smart, right? Because they know how that can empower. And I think Maurice is a good example in Detroit, who's allowing us to go into communities and be ourselves, which can then inspire youth and the elderly and people to say, wow, we can have that as well. The second piece is, if you go to the Nashville website and even the NOC website, when we start a lot of these public art projects, we bring in youth, right? And we have them basically track the project. The Nashville project was 4 years, and these are amazing hip hop artists there who basically created art, spoken word, and all of that to go along with the piece. And on opening day, I mean, no one could talk because we were all in tears because we watched these kids grow up with the projects. And that's another way that we try to build this in within the projects that we work on.
Hi, my name's Chloe Moore, and I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. So the Nashville project to me is extremely exciting. For those who aren't familiar with Memphis or Tennessee, as I've met a few who haven't been, right now we are currently under this great revitalization project, which is just hard-ass gentrification. And so to give a little more context, Memphis is a predominantly black city, right? But we have public spaces that are dedicated to Nathan Bedford Forrest and a Tennessee Historic Commission that is aggressively dedicated to preserving that, right? And we've also seen how in the middle of all of this revitalization, they are protecting those spaces and not really giving any kind of credence or respect to the cultural vibrancy that the communities currently hold. And so I'm curious as to how, one, you all got that public art project going in Nashville, which is an even bougier city than Memphis. And two, what would be your advice to people who are currently in that activism space and are trying to get in front of those people who have the development dollars and the strategic plan to say this art not only matters, but here's how we can create it and put it in this space?
I'll start out. Nashville, it's through their public art program. It's not me, but they have some pretty enlightened directors there, but they also didn't have anything that dealt with the civil rights movement, right? And so the people that were in the image were basically the veterans who basically pushed and championed. And let me just say this, that piece costs like $300,000. So it's on the cheap, right? And so we really advocated that they need to do more. And the veterans are on them to do this. I've been in Memphis, and I was there when they were under construction for the museum, and there was something that was intriguing to me about the Civil Rights Museum was you were allowed to go on the balcony while it was under construction and the music Mahalia is playing. And it was one of the most cathartic moments that I had because it was real space and it wasn't inside. And so that's one of the things that I don't think Memphis should have a cultural district, a civil rights culture. I think it's the whole city, right? I mean, because once they give us that thing, that's it. And so we have to somehow be able to like permeate and say, we live everywhere, and every place is important, and there are stories everywhere. And I think we have to begin to articulate that. But we've kind of settled for, we get our little thing, and then we celebrate every 10 years or every 50 years. But we need to begin to talk about the importance of those communities and document those communities and begin to articulate their values. So that's one way I think that we can start to do that.
I just wanted to let everyone know there's about time for 2 more questions. So if you have one, please raise your hand now.
Hi, can you hear me? Diana Fernandez. I'm a landscape architect at Sasaki, and I have a question for both of you, actually. Walter, your work is super inspiring. I've been following you since I graduated from Temple University in Philadelphia back in 2012. And seeing your work, to me, starts to hint at something, you just started talking about this just now. It's more than just giving people the historic space in the community that alludes to this legacy. It really starts to define new paradigms of what design excellence could be. And as young designers, as a landscape architect myself, what's your advice in terms of how do we sort of blow up the value system to be able to allow for new paradigms in terms of how we think about what design excellence is and should be be in our cities, how we can redefine public space to be much more inclusive of all the different cultures and nuances that exist in the urban realm. And then Michelle, my question to you is, how does that role of sort of the public realm and landscape architecture play in how we're communicating design in the museum setting, you know, the legacy of the landscape with culture, and how are we talking about those things and moving that paradigm forward, since it's a space in which we all exist and is very relevant, as person from Oakland said, you know, you experience it every day. We all do. We all exist within it. So I feel like landscape architecture plays a really big role in that conversation. Thank you.
It's a great question, because you're going to put landscape now in your nomenclature, right? Okay. I just want to say, stop following the ASLA landscape architecture rulebook, right? I mean, stop doing what everybody else does, right? I mean, you know, between bioswales and, you know, street tree plant, I mean, all that crap. I mean, it's just this normative stuff that we've all accepted as the thing you do. And it's all the same, no matter where you go. You pick out a bench from a catalog, it's the same thing. You don't have much stuff to deal with. Landscape people. I mean, you got like garbage cans, lights, some benches, some paving, and then you get it all out of a magazine versus like sitting there and going, how can I make this shit, right? And the more you start to question that, the more you actually start to see where you are, and you start to say, I have something to say. And so I would just say, you know, stop following, you know, and start leading, right? So.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I should have added that in my presentation, but certainly landscape architecture, landscape design is one of the areas that we are interested in. In fact, this is my first time meeting Walter, but we've had a conversation as well about collecting, and so it's on our it's part of our mission. In terms of the landscape of the museum itself, and maybe Mabel was referring a bit about this in her question, the landscape architect team was Gustafson, Guthrie, Nichols, maybe. And there is a bit written on our museum website. I don't want to misquote, so I'm not going to try to remember everything that is part of the landscape design. But I will say, for me, some of the things that kind of stand out in terms of the space, it's a combination between what the Freelon Ajay Bond Smith Group team and Gustafson Guthrie Nickel worked on together. So some of the things, there's a porch feature, kind of a canopy above the museum, and there's a whole long history about why the porch is significant within African diaspora context. But underneath the porch feature is a reflecting pool, which actually has some quotes in it, and maybe some of this is, you know, these are kinds of maybe tropes that we have all seen in other spaces, but particularly with the museum, thinking about the promenade of the National Mall, it's not a space that has a lot of trees, so when you arrive to the museum on that south side entrance, you can enter on the south or north side, you can walk under this canopy, there's this reflecting pool, and the architects and landscape architects talk about this as a cooling microclimate, right? And so it provides shade, it provides refuge, but it also has this sort of cultural reference back to what happens on porches within Black communities, spaces for sharing, generational stories, hair braiding. Somebody might be on your porch, but they may not be able to get into your house. And so it has all these sorts of like cultural references. Other parts of the museum's landscape have to do with these kind of curving pathways, water features. The contemplative court that you saw actually is an oculus on above ground. And so when you're walking above ground, there's an oculus where you can kind of look down into the museum. There's a reading grove. There's, you know, fancy benches. So there are lots of different things happening on the landscape of the mall. And then one more thing that I will add is that, again, this juxtaposition. So in terms of having a museum that looks like ours, which is quite distinct looking with these three tiers, this sort of corona on the mall, and having these African diasporic references, whether it's the Aloe of Issei sculpture or the porch or the filigree that connects to the South, and also in my mind to West African and Caribbean sort of brise soleil features. But then we're right next to the Washington Monument, and David Adjaye has been really clear about saying that this is, the Washington Monument, of course, is an obelisk, right? It's a kind of Southern Egyptian form, and so we have these two African descent and African-inspired forms in conversation adjacent to each other at sort of the center of American historical architecture. And so that's beyond landscape, but these are some of the things that we interpret in that exhibition about a century in the making in the building of the museum.
And the last question, I think there's a gentleman up here in the front.
Okay. I guess not.
Hi, good morning. My name is Rodney Williams. I actually have worked with Michelle before she got to AfricanAmerican Museum, and job well done. Walter, I'm embarrassed to say something. I live in D.C. area, about 10 minutes from the free work you're working on. I had no idea this was going on. I want to say something that maybe we need to be aware of the events that are going on that are being produced like this around the country. We need some kind of a vehicle, because I'm very proud to know that that's in my neighborhood, but I don't know a damn thing about it. So I'm embarrassed. How do we find out about this? Maybe we should plant that seed. 2 years from now, we could talk about there's a way of getting all these projects out to all of us to go and see. So I just want to plant that seed there. I'm a graphic designer that had a firm for 35 years. I'll work on it. Let me know.
It's good to know.
All right, I think that then wraps our second session. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Michelle, for all of your gracious responses. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Chanel, because I imagine everyone is getting kind of hungry out there.
Thank you all for your questions and for an important conversation about how we communicate our values through our work and through our professions. At this time, we will provide our conference attendees with lunch catered by Haley House Bakery and Cafe. Haley House is a local cafe based in Roxbury, and we want to show support for local businesses by having them cater this conference. To help the distribution of food go smoothly, we have designated lunch distribution spots in Chow House, the Porticos, and the Pit. And for people who aren't familiar with this building, there will be volunteers to help guide you to those locations. Gluten-free, vegan, and vegetarian food options will be based in the Chow House. During lunch, there will be a Black Space moderated discussion to learn more about how we can build coalitions during this conference and extend it back to our communities. Black Space is a group that was formed after the 2015 conference. Also at your lunch tables, you will see postcards related to the Real Talk exhibition. These postcards will have questions such as, how do you create coalitions through design? How do you resist through design? So feel free to fill out these postcards and share your stories. If you finish lunch early, please take a moment to have your photograph taken as a part of the Real Talk exhibition. Photos will be taken in the corridor adjacent to the conference registration tables. And we will reconvene here in Piper at 1:30. Have a good lunch.